a little more push. Just this. Advance, right, retreat, or go backwards, left. Good?
Thank you so much. Sure. Good morning. I'd like to share with you Richard J. Walsh, publisher, activist, husband, and father. Richard John Walsh was the first of 3 children born to Joseph and Elizabeth Walsh in 1886 in Leon, Kansas. Flat broke, the young couple and their toddler headed back east to Reading, Massachusetts to start anew. On a salary of only $2,500 a year, his father managed to send Richard to Harvard in 1903, where he was selected for membership in prestigious organizations and became a scholar, a writer, and a poet. The honor of honors came on February 23rd of 1907, when he was asked to write a speech for President Teddy Roosevelt. Graduating with honors in 1907 at the age of 20, Richard Walsh married his high school sweetheart, Ruby Hopkins Abbott, in their hometown of Reading, Massachusetts. Their daughter Natalie was born in the fall of 1909. 3 years later, Richard Jr. came into their lives, and Elizabeth followed in 1917. Ever searching for a job that would stretch and challenge him, he spent the first decade of his career trying on a variety of possibilities in the publishing world to see what would fit, including reporting, advertising, membership, publicity, freelance, copy, art, and illustration. His positions included advisor, chairman, publisher, and editor. He did it all. And what a career builder that decade would turn out to be. Richard Walsh created the John Day Publishing Company in 1926, located on 45th Street in New York City, a city which would remain for a lifetime the hub of his professional world. He named the company after the master printer of the English Reformation and served as its editor-in-chief and president for over 30 years. His prestigious career, spanning more than half a century, included his own contributions to the literary world through novels, poetry, biographies, research, and articles ranging from the selection of the current Dalai Lama to spinning wheel cooperatives in China. Richard Walsh authored The Making of Buffalo Bill in collaboration with Milton. Oh, what has happened here? I don't know what to tell you. Okay. Wouldn't that be?
We're good, don't worry about that.
Okay, so shall I just do, let's see if this is going to work. There we go. Magically, thank you. Richard Walsh authored The Making of Buffalo Bill in collaboration with Milton S. Salisbury in 1928. Salisbury passed away before the book was finished, forcing Walsh to do much of the original research. Critics praised his careful investigation, attention to detail, and clear, concise writing style. In a 1929 letter, W.S. Campbell, professor at the University of Oklahoma and recognized authority on the life of Bill Cody, wrote to Richard Walsh, "It may be of satisfaction to you to know that your life of Cody is the only book, I think, in which I find nothing which disagrees with the truth as I have found it. You did a fine piece of work there." In 1929, Richard Walsh met someone who would forever change his life. One of the many literary agencies Mr. Walsh worked with, the David Loy Agency, sent a manuscript that had previously been rejected by a number of publishers. The manuscript came from China and was written by an unknown American Presbyterian missionary, Pearl Buck. Although the book was not as good as it could be, Walsh was moved. He told her that although he would publish her book, he felt she could improve, and he promised to read her future manuscripts. Walsh believed the title would not work and suggested changing it to East Wind, West Wind. Pearl Buck returned to China, and her book was published in 1930. Walsh later revealed, "I decided to publish it not because I liked it, but because I thought her capable of something better." He encouraged her to continue writing and to send him another manuscript as soon as possible. 4 months later, a new manuscript arrived. Richard Walsh read it and was pleased with the story, but again, he believed the title, Wan Lung, would not appeal to the American public. He suggested a new title, The Good Earth, and the rest, as they say, is history. As soon as the book was published in 1931, it became a bestseller. Richard Walsh played a large role in assuring that success. He wrote an untold number of letters promoting the book and instructed his employees to do the same. Walsh felt The Good Earth had great potential, and it was up to them to get the book into the hands of the public. To that end, he was instrumental in bringing the paperback book to the United States, and in 1938 made certain The Good Earth became the first mass-marketed, pocket-sized paperback book ever printed in the United States. The Good Earth continued to sell well, and the John Day Company attained more notoriety. In 1932, Mr. Walsh sent a cablegram to Pearl S. Buck in China, congratulating her on winning the Pulitzer Prize. Not long after, Pearl Buck arrived in the United States with her husband, John Lossing Buck. He was on sabbatical at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, from his agricultural mission work. During this time, there were many letters exchanged between Richard Walsh and Pearl Buck as they set up times to talk business and attend functions to promote her writing. Pearl Buck comments, "He wrote the most charming and articulate letters I had ever read. I saw him for the first time, sun-browned and with eyes of startling blue. I was speechless with my habitual shyness, but he was completely at ease, which he always was, and everywhere and everyone, the happy tribute to me when the next day I faced the formidable press in New York. He knew the reporters, however, and they knew him, for he had begun his professional life as a newspaperman, and they liked him." A second printing of The Good Earth was ordered, and Richard Walsh continued to encourage Mrs. Buck to submit the manuscripts. Sons, the second book that was to come in the Good Earth trilogy, was published in 1932, and The House Divided, published in 1935. Pearl Buck left China in 1934, never to return, divorced her husband John Lossing Buck, and purchased Green Hills Farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The 52 acres with a working barn, neglected farmhouse, small milk house, and 18th century one-room homestead would require massive renovations, which would take decades to complete. The New York Times announced the marriage of Richard J. Walsh and Pearl S. Buck on June 11th of 1935, and thus began one of the most productive 25-year partnerships of the 20th century. Pearl Buck writes, "And what fun it has been from the very beginning. How satisfying the years together. We had begun in New York, where his life had been for 30 years before we met. The mid-1930s found the Walshes living in New York City and visiting the in-progress countryside retreat of Green Hills Farm on the weekends." In the spring of 1936, less than a year after their marriage, Richard Walsh, age 49, and Pearl Buck, age 43, adopted 2 one-month-old boys who they named Richard Stalding Walsh and John Stalding Walsh. The infants were selected for the Walshes by a specialized adoption agency in Elviston, Illinois, known as the Cradle. Some of the Cradle's most famous adoptive parents included George Burns and Gracie Allen, Bob Hope, Al Jolson, Donna Reed, and Gail Sayers. The children spent their first years in the prestigious 277 Park Avenue complex between 47th and 48th Streets. The Walshes would retain this New York City residence for several decades. According to Pearl Buck, he had always wanted a big family, and how he enjoyed its gradual accumulation. 2 years slipped by, and they held nothing but joy and content, and we took 2 more babies. Edgar and Jean were adopted from the Cradle in Illinois in 1937. Then she recounts, his next dream, which was to live in the country, became a necessity, and they came to live more permanently at Green Hills Farm. From 1934 until 1946, Richard Walsh, in addition to running his publishing house, was contributor and editor-in-chief of Asia magazine. He shifted its emphasis from luxury travel to a forum for discussion of Asian politics and a showcase for the art, literature, and culture of the Middle East, the Far East, and South Asia. Walsh desired to look upon communism as objectively as looking upon art, and bring to religious concepts an open mind as we bring to economic problems. Widely read before and during the war, its circulation declined with the American disinterest in that part of the world after the war. As a result, in 1945, he merged the magazine with Free World and Inter-American to create a new journal, the United Nations World. Winning the Nobel Prize in 1938 was beyond anything that Pearl Buck believed was hers to achieve. So much so that when the announcement came, she requested that Richard validate its authenticity. For Richard Walsh, there was no need to verify. As evidenced by this letter and many like it, Richard Walsh had been hard at work behind the scenes, imploring various organizations, in this case her alma mater, Randolph-Macon College, to nominate her. He was not only her front man, he was the man behind the scenes. "And of myself, what shall I say?" penned Pearl Buck. "It was he who saw something in my first small book, a tentative effort rejected by all other publishers until he perceived in it the possibility that its author might one day write a better book. His staff was equally divided against the book, and it fell to him as the president of the company to cast his vote. He voted for it, and on that narrow chance, my life began. I had come to depend very much on his genius for dealing with the improbable, for solving the unsolvable, and achieving the impossible, and this always without the help of his friends. He had friends beyond number, high, low, some of them among the wealthiest men in the world, others poor. The wealthy did not help him in 2 financial crises of his life. He weathered his crises alone and triumphantly. The poor borrowed money from him without shame. To my indignation, distributed to rich and poor alike. He maintained a smiling indifference. His unshakable good humor, his cheerful pessimism, his flashes of impatience, his affectionate cynicism toward mankind, and above all, his gay acceptance of life as he found it, defined him. His editing skills were pure genius. His own opinions were always firmly on the side of the intellectual liberal. Yet, he published authors who were conservative and sometimes in the narrowest sense. He believed that they too had the right to be heard, and if they presented their opinions well, he gave their books the same editorial care that he gave to all others. The range of the authors he developed was from Fritz Steinberg to James Burnham. An editor, he believed, had the high privilege of discovering talent and the duty of helping it to be developed to its best fruit, and then to presenting it to the world. She continued, he was an impresario of writers and books, a man of such tender understanding of the needs and the delicacies and shynesses of talented persons that he guided without seeming to do so, drawing forth their ideas by skillful questions and honest praise and appreciation. Of the numerous letters I received after his death, many were from writers who said that until he helped them understand themselves, they had not been able to write. The list of authors who had their writings published by the John Day Company is distinguished. Among them are Albert Einstein, Joseph Stalin, and Nehru. However, there was an instance when the rejection rather than the encouragement of a book brought him headlines of praise from the New York Times. Walsh was approached by Adolf Hitler to publish what was touted by Hitler to be a compilation of speeches he had delivered since January of 1933. When Richard Walsh received the complete copy of the contents, however, he canceled the publication. The book is too near straight propaganda, Richard Walsh said in an interview to the New York Times on November 21st of 1933. We accepted and we announced the book in good faith on the basis of incomplete copy, omitting all the references to the treatment of the Jews. To publish such a volume would be to lend ourselves to the Nazis as an agent of propaganda, rather than to fulfill the true function of a publisher, which is to throw light, not to conceal. Pearlbuck comments, he was a genius of his own sort in coaxing books out of writers who did not know they were writers. A notable example was a short manuscript that came to him one day from an American woman in Siam, entitled The King's English, and the king was the King of Siam. The author had done a nice little piece of research into the king's vernacular English, which was fearful and delightful. But he saw much more in that little essay, and he invited the American woman to write more about the king. A few articles arrived, and at last, upon his persuasion and encouragement, a book-length manuscript. He set to work to create a book out of the material that he found there, and to determine what was not there. The result eventually was a fascinating book which he called Anna and the King of Siam. And this book later became the fabulous musical on Broadway, The King and I, by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Hammerstein, being a close friend and neighbor, was influenced by Walsh and his respect for Asia.